Okay, so welcome to the Bootcamp for New Recruits, a brief introduction to military SF. I'm Kate. See, I told you I get my name
You
wrong
did. You
every
warned
time.
us.
I'm Kate, and I'm your moderator for today. With me is Edmond, Kat, and Damien. So I've asked you to do your own introduction. So if we start with Edmond, if you'd like to give us a brief introduction.
Hello, folks. My name is Edwin Barrett. I'm a resident of Dublin, and I'm a military science fiction author with 4 titles to my name. The most recent of which, shameless plug, is my new book, Parabellum. I don't know if that turns up back to front for you. I very much focus on relatively near future military science fiction, and I have also a background in history as an interest and wargaming as a hobby. So that's me.
And Kat, if you'd like to give us your intro.
I'm Kat Dodd. As you can tell from my accent, I am not from Ireland. I'm actually from the States. I am a military brat. And so I grew up moving around a lot. And oh my gosh, everything just flew out my head. I'm very sorry for this. I am also a writer. I don't have any military sci-fi out at the moment. I'm working on some projects. I will always be working on projects. And I grew up on military sci-fi.
And Damien, if you give yours.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Damien Larkin. I'm an Irish military science fiction author. My first book, Big Red, came out in 2018. And I have to say it was an absolute fantastic experience. I'm a co-founder of the British and Irish Writing Community, which is a network of writers spread across Ireland and the UK. We're a non-political group. We basically just try and encourage and network and promote writing within our communities. I also spent 7 years in the Irish Reserve Defence Forces. I was in the infantry, and towards the last couple of years, I moved over to a weapons platoon. So I specialised in the likes of the 60 Vector mortar. And I have to say, 7 years in the reserves was 7 of the best years of my life. But that did kind of influence my writing a little bit. Big Red originally was, I had it in my head as typical kind of military science fiction, gung-ho US Marines, big muscles going in, shooting up the place. And about 2 pages into it, I said, no, that's not the story I want to write. I sat back and thought about it and wrote Big Red from the perspective of an Irish person. So it follows Irish and British soldiers, very kind of young, conscripted into a paramilitary organization on Mars, and follows their year-long tour duty. So book 2 is coming out in May 2021, and it's called Blood Red Sand, and I can't wait for it.
Really good.
Very good. Sounds excellent. Okay, so that does lead us to a simple question, or I guess the root of the question is, what is military sci-fi? What is the definition of it, or how do you know it when you see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Damien,
no,
ahead.
By all means, go for it.
Go ahead, Damien.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So military science fiction, there's a lot of kind of instances of it in speculative fiction throughout the late 20th and early 20th century. But, whatever, this century and the last century. There was a lot of instances of it in speculative fiction, but as an actual specific subgenre, you only really kind of saw it emerge a little bit, I suppose, around Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, which I think was kind of published in 1959. It really started gaining popularity in the 1970s when a lot of kind of Vietnam veterans came back after the war and experienced, different sides of it, not necessarily what they were seeing or what the American public were seeing on television. And they looked for ways of interpreting the horror, the violence, the different events of military camaraderie. And they used science fiction as an outlet because the era was very polarized between, pro and anti-war kind of movements in America and throughout the world. And they used this as a way of kind of getting their message and getting their story kind of out there. So you had the likes of David Weber, David Drake, Joe Haldeman. I don't think he was in the military, but he wrote a reaction to Starship Troopers. And that's when you start to see the genre kind of move from being a bit of a fringe element to sci-fi to become more mainstream. even into the likes of today, you have the likes of John Scalzi's Old Man's War, which is an absolute phenomenal read, I have to say. And even there's a very kind of passionate indie community within military science fiction. Like one of my favorite authors of this year is a US Marine or a former Marine called Trip Ainsworth, who came out with a series called Smoke Pit Fairy Tales. And he kind of writes military science fiction from the perspective of a more kind of modern US soldier, someone who kind of has experience in the likes of Afghanistan. So I think in a lot of ways, it's a way of soldiers, not necessarily all kind of soldiers, but people trying to understand the horrors of war, the like why we do the things that we do in a little bit more of a neutral setting. You take Star Wars, for example. I wouldn't necessarily call that military science fiction, but a lot of what they did in there was analogies to the Cold War and what was kind of happening around them. So I think it's as a vehicle, it's a fantastic way of kind of taking a step back, kind of looking in at ourselves as a society, and just exploring the different themes that impact us all.
I would slightly disagree in the sense of I would say, my definition of military science fiction would be to say it's a genre focused on people inside a formal rank-based military structure, with combat effectively being kind of optional. To my mind, Star Trek is at least partially military science fiction, even though technically, they will go through entire episodes without shooting anyone.
Yeah.
There is a captain. He is the formal in-charge guy. There is a rank structure all the way down to Tiddles the ship's cats. And, there is...
Spot.
It is that kind of... So Star Trek is always, is a military science fiction at least adjacent, where something like Firefly isn't, where there isn't, a formal chain of command, except the one that Al Rutting beats you with. So that would be kind of my take, that combat, I mean, it's obviously when you think of military science fiction, you think of, as you say, power armored Marines or spaceships shooting at each other. But in my mind, it is more, what's more central is there is a chain of command. There is a guy at the top or woman at the top, and there is very much a coherent chain all the way down to the bottom, and your characters are somewhere in that chain, basically.
Kat, your thoughts?
I would have to disagree on Firefly. I understand your point on it. And I definitely do agree on Star Trek. That's actually a point I was going to make if nobody else did. But with Firefly, even though there isn't necessarily a rank on the ship, there is a rank in the society. And like we see that all throughout with oh my gosh, words are escaping me. But the main reason I did disagree on Firefly is the war is so present.
Yeah.
Mal and Zoe fought in the war, and they're so disillusioned by the way that they were treated. So I would say that even if it's not necessarily military sci-fi, it would also be military sci-fi adjacent, because the horrors of war and all of that being so present to the story, you can't remove that from their stories.
Yeah, I mean, the horrors of war is definitely an important one to military science fiction, because, I mean, if you take the Forever War, which I know you mentioned, Damien, the author, the bits which I just, the combat bits, the shouting and the shooting are in some respects less important than the fact that, if people aren't familiar with the book, it's one where there's temporal distortion. So guys go out for a tour of duty of 6 months, but when they come back, 10, 20, 50, 100 years have passed. So it was more the idea of soldiers going out, and I think it was a reaction to Vietnam, soldiers going out from a society and coming back to an America that was radically different from the one they remembered. Now, there's a point in the book, without going into too much of spoilers, where the characters come back after one tour, and they've been away from the perspective of Earth for centuries, and society has changed, where as a population control method, everyone is now homosexual. That's normal. So the character, being a man who's physically attracted to women, he's described as the old queer. Apologies to anyone that finds that offensive. But yeah, it was that kind of society changes. We kind of take that version away with us and don't come back to it.
Which leads to a question, or I mean, it leads to a thought around when people think of military sci-fi. Obviously, they have their own concepts in their head when they're doing it. But and Damien, you mentioned when you were writing your book as well that it started out as a gung-ho sort of blow 'em up,
Yeah.
Big explosions. My kind of action movie style concept is, you go out, it's a bug hunt, you're gonna blow the heck out of everything everywhere, but so there's military sort of science fiction that is that kind of concept, and then there's the reaction to that, which is the how do you deal with the soldier, the man who or woman whose life has been changed forever because they left a world that is different from the one they're coming back to, and they left as a different person to the one they're coming back because of the things that they've been through and the traumas. And do you find that the people have assumptions around what military science fiction is, that it must be gung-ho, blow them up, charge in there and just not care, or that it must be the horrors of war, the trauma of the vet,
Yeah, absolutely. To be perfectly honest, like I never really kind of read that much military science fiction before I'd got my publishing deal. It was only after my publisher kind of offered a contract that she happened to say, oh, this is very kind of military sci-fi, which is great for us because that's one of our highest selling genres. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. Okay, Google's military sci-fi. Realized I've been watching it like for most of my life, from the reboot of Battlestar Galactica to the film Starship Troopers. Absolutely brilliant. I didn't even read Starship Troopers, interestingly enough, till I was about halfway through the editing process of Big Red, and that's why my mind was blown, because there is kind of a couple of similarities there. But yeah, to answer your question, there can be a concept of what military science fiction is, and that's something that I try to explore a little bit with Big Red. As I said, I started off with that mindset of this is going to be just grenades, nukes, bombs, aliens everywhere, and I kind of took that step back and said, I want to write my own story. I don't want it to be a knockoff of what you'd see on the screen. I want it to be something not just for me, but something specifically as an Irish person and as a former reservist soldier. And for that reason, I decided to kind of take a step back from some of the bigger elements that I had in mind. So it's told from the point of view of an Irishman, I think it was in his late 20s, who basically gets sent to Mars through this process called the compression matrix, which basically takes your mental waves or your mental energy and transfers it into a cloned version of your own body, which is, they're called hollows, and they can be programmed to do certain things. So from the soldier's perspective, you're looking at this day-to-day grind of marching, drilling, training up on weapons. They start off on security duty in a base in the colony called New Berlin. So it is a bit of this, real kind of monotonous stuff that I remember from my days, what we used to call square bashing, where you just basically march around a square for several hours and then strip and assemble a weapon, put it back together, do it all over again, this type of thing. And it gradually kind of builds up as the hollow soldiers start to believe that they're being manipulated, that there's certain things and certain elements at play that aren't necessarily what they seem. So it's from that kind of point on, it starts kind of gradually escalating a little bit in the violence and in the plot twists, and there's a lot of plot twists in there. But I think there is a perspective from certain elements that it has to be a certain way. But I think as writers, it's up to us to kind of set the bar in what we class as military science fiction, or what we want to tell in our story. So I've certainly have never gotten any kind of negative feedback on it in terms of the genre that I write in or anything like that. Or no one's kind of said to me, you should have more explosions here, you should wipe out this entire alien race, and why didn't you bomb this asteroid? It's a lot of it is I think it's because it's done from the perspective of a normal soldier, not a Rambo superhero, big bulging muscles, smoking a cigar, blasting off a machine gun, because it's someone that each of us can relate to. It's your friend, it's your cousin, it's your colleague. I think that's what makes it kind of more accessible.
I think that's one of the things about military science fiction. There's a lot of levels to it. I mean, you're taking from the standpoint of the guy in the foxhole, where the general or the admiral kind of on the flagship, which will be where my focus would tend to be. It's a lot more, I'm trying to predict what the other side is going to do. It's, by the time the shouting and the shooting starts, the critical decisions were made 2 hours earlier.
Yeah.
Because I'm big into kind of the military history of the first half of the 20th century, I take a lot of my cues from kind of the past battles, where if you take something like Jutland, for example, you get the really critical decisions are made before the two admirals know where each other's fleets are. It's somebody essentially, right, do I deploy my fleet to the left or do I deploy my fleet to the right? And the how this is going to pan out is very sort of, very different answers. And it's very much the limitations that people are working. The fog of war is the classic phrase.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Kat, do you have any comments on that one?
I think that in general, in any genre, you're going to run into people who have very rigid ideas and very defined ideas of what meets the genre standards and what doesn't. And it's just because people are always going to have opinions.
Yeah.
And opinions aren't bad. They just are. They are what they are. So yes, I do think that there are going to be some people who are like, no, military sci-fi must be this. And some people are going to be, no, it must be this. And then for most of us, we're just like, it's military sci-fi.
It's a very broad area.
Yeah.
Now, there was one book I wanted to mention. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. It was called His Majesty Starship. Now, I can't remember the author's name, and I think I left the Kindle upstairs, so tough luck. I'm not going to be able to look that up.
Someone like Cornell.
But yeah, it's a relatively recent book, actually, as in within the last 20 years. But it's one. I mean, it is a rank structure. It's a relatively low-tech setting that ships are effectively lobbing nukes or canister shot at each other.
Right.
But it's again, it's military. The military aspects aren't the entire book. There's a lot of what you'd have to describe as politics in it, but it's that element of war as politics by another means.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Do you think that having experience in the military is a help, a hindrance, or does it potentially change the story that you're telling? For example, Damien, you have experience of being a soldier in, whereas Ed, you're more into the military history side of things. Has that, and Kat, you've got the experience of growing up in that universe. Does that change the story that you want to tell, that you want to see? Kat,
sorry,
you want to go ahead first there?
Too excited. Keep jumping in.
I definitely think that it would be a help. I don't think it's a necessity. I don't think it would be a hindrance unless it comes into this is my experience, so therefore it's everybody's experience. Because that idea is always going to be a hindrance. Help, hindrance. What was the other question?
Just how you change your experience.
I think that in terms of military culture, there's some things that are just true about military culture across the world, across ideals, because we all have the ideals of these are the people that fight for us. These are the things that we want to uphold. And I think that that's just kind of true in so many people's minds, partially because we have so many military fiction, not necessarily sci-fi, but just military fiction in general that shows that. There's going to be some aspects of military culture that you just don't know about without having experienced it. And it's because it's things that it doesn't occur to you to ask. Like the example that I use is we went to movies on the military base a lot because it was a lot cheaper. And one of the things that happens on the military bases with America is before the movie, before the trailers, like what kicks off the trailers is a flag on the screen and the national anthem. And you stand up and you salute the flag, and this is just a common thing. So the first time that I remember going to a movie theater that wasn't on base, the lights go down and I stand up because I'm prepared to do the national anthem. And it doesn't play, and this was very confusing to my child mind.
Brilliant.
And it's that kind of thing, because unless you've experienced it, it's not going to occur to you to ask about it.
Ed,
Yeah.
have you any?
Fair point. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming from the standpoint of, my knowledge is all kind of book-based. That's, on one hand, I know you're in a different place, probably on other people's screens, so I shouldn't point. I know, Kat, Kat and Damien both would have, you write effectively what you know. I think I think the one thing you can definitely say. So if your personal experience is working, serving in the reserves or directly in the military, you are going to be aware of certain things. And if you're like myself and do a lot of reading around the topic, you're aware of other things. So yeah, I think that would be my take from it.
And Damien, your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so I mean, first off, I don't think you have to have served in the military to write military science fiction or any type of fiction. I don't think it depends, like what you choose to write as a writer. It's entirely up to you. And I don't think you have to tick boxes X, Y, and Z. This makes you a military science fiction writer. This makes you a grimdark writer. I mean, you can apply right across the board to any genre. The same thing would be like, say, if you're writing a grimdark book, are you a sword wielding, expert? Do you know about ancient military tactics? Now, one of my good colleagues, Lee Connolly, author of the fantastic Dead Saga series, like he is fully trained in a longsword, and he kind of teaches people that stuff, and that can kind of add an element to his writing and makes it a little bit more kind of realistic, I suppose, because he knows the weapons and it comes across the confidence in his words. But like in general, I don't think you need to have the experience as long as you have the abilities to write a really good story or tell the story that you want to tell. Like for myself, I certainly did benefit from the experience that I had in the reserves for 7 years because, I understand, I suppose, the mindset. I understand the weapons drills. I understand the tactics. Like I would have drilled in what we call section and attacks and platoon and attacks and company in attacks, which means that I'd have a bit of an understanding of the layout of a battle scene. And I think the best example I could kind of think of would be Band of Brothers, the HBO series. If you see that, it's a very relentless kind of program, especially as the American soldiers are fighting the Nazis. But you can see it's done expertly. It's right down to a T. They're using proper military tactics and how they take the field at the end of the first episode. And that's the type of stuff that I would have done. So I would have kind of brought that level of realism into Big Red, and it's something I'm expanding on a good bit in Blood Red Sand, because Big Red was a bit more section based, which is over here in Ireland. The section is about 9 people. I think it varies from country to country on that. But in Blood Red Sand, it's more a kind of battalion level, so it's more kind of like a lot more soldiers doing a lot more things and a bit more of a higher intensity kind of battle. So it certainly benefited me, but I don't think you have to have that military experience.
Of course, I mean, this is probably a very generalized piece of advice. One of the things you do have to be a little bit careful of is making the assumption that what you know is what's universal. I mean, you've just thrown the terms section-based and battalion-based. Now, I know at least roughly what those two terms mean, that you're getting up to battalion level, you're talking up to hundreds of guys. How much depends on where, when, and which country.
Yeah.
Somebody who has no military experience, it's a case of he just threw 2 big words out as if they meant something. And I mean, my own personal experience is when I was getting my first book, The Nameless War, edited.
Yeah.
I put in a term, IFF, which stands for Identify Friend or Foe. It's basically so that, when you send out a radar beam to something, you know if that's a friendly or a potential hostile. My editor, who had had a background in military history, said, "What the hell's that?" His background in history was more medieval, but it never crossed my mind to sort of identify friend or foe.
Yeah, I mean that's a fair point, and it is something I think that we have to kind of keep in mind. I suppose the main thing is who's your target audience, who is it you're specifically aiming to connect with. I mean there is a wide range of military science fiction fans out there who maybe would have no connections to the military, but there would be kind of people in there who have essentially. So I think it kind of comes down to do you want to tell a clear-cut story that every single person can understand, but might lose a little bit of realism? Or do you want to just keep a couple of those terms in there if they complement the story, knowing that maybe a couple of people may not get it? Now, for the likes of IFF, I've never heard that term ever, so I wouldn't have.
Maybe a rather outdated term at this stage. I mean, I would, as I say, my focus would tend to be kind of the wars of the early 20th century, so it may be an obsolete acronym at this stage. But yeah, it's sometimes that element of kind of having to have a little pause and say, this makes perfect sense to me. Does somebody need to have served in the defense forces, or it's their national equivalent for a couple of years, and can I effectively explain it without breaking flow?
Yeah, I mean, it can be tricky, and it's something maybe you can kind of give me a bit of insight in this. I was mentioned one of my favorite military series, military science fiction series. It's Smoke Pit Fairy Tales by Trip Ainsworth, and he is a U.S. Marine, but he used a term in it, and to this day I still don't quite understand what it is. But I think it was something like a CANT team, CAANT. And from the descriptions, it sounds like it's some motorized, like a Jeep with a machine gun on it. And so there's some sort of fire support group. But even with, coming from, military experience, I don't understand what it means. I get the gist of what he's saying. And I think that kind of like, a lot of people who maybe don't have that military experience, if they pick up a book or two and they see these types of terms, they're not going to be necessarily alienated by it, but what would you reckon on that? Or do you even know what a CANT team is? Or
I'm actually looking it up to see, because it's not something that I'm familiar with, but I feel like it's something I'm familiar with.
It might be Marine specific, I don't know, and I could even be spelling that wrong. But as far as I know, it was CAANT, and something like that, or maybe CAT team or something. But anyway, I got the gist of what he was trying to say, but I still wasn't 100% sure, because there's no kind of Irish equivalent to that I'm aware of.
And I think that one of the questions that you have to ask yourself is this something that people can understand through context?
Yeah.
If they can't, is it necessary that they understand?
Yeah, that's sometimes it.
Absolutely.
Does it give the necessary flavor? Does somebody need to absolutely understand, or does it kind of, I've got enough of an idea, I'm good.
Like IFF, probably necessary for them to understand. Can't, apparently not, since you were able to do it without understanding.
Again, context made it, like, it did explain it out, because I mean, when he said CANT team and they said something about machine guns on the top of a Jeep, I kind of had an idea of what he was talking about. I just wasn't sure how they kind of fit in compared to Irish standards, but it's still a great story.
So that, both that and something Ed said, and one of the comments that has come in from the audience, you mentioned like the details not necessarily mattering as long as the story is understandable, and the changes. So a military historian from the medieval period doesn't know the terms from the early 20th century, but maybe somebody from the later 20th century doesn't know those terms either, because they've changed over time. The other thing that changes a lot over time is the technology, and we've seen huge changes in how warfare works in the last 10-20 years, with the reduction of feet on the ground concept, that we try not to send soldiers in until the last possible moment, in bulk at any rate.
Sorry, apologies.
How does that affect the way that military science fiction is written? How does that change the imagery of sci-fi warfare, of sci-fi, military sci-fi? Ed, go for it.
I think one of the things I'd say is, you've said, changed in the last 10, 20 years. I would argue, I would say flat out, well, actually, it's been changing radically for much longer than that. I mean, if you go back to the end of the Napoleonic period, so about 1815, and you could take a soldier from 100 years before that, he's using a comparable weapon, he's using comparable tactics. He'll be at a disadvantage, but he will at least be able to put up a fight. But if you move a soldier from the Battle of Waterloo to the Battle of the Somme in 1916, he's a target. He's the poor sod's never going to see what hits him. That technology, particularly in the last 200 years, technology has absolutely leapt forwards. Now, sometimes it'll stabilize, but at other times, particularly during times of war, technology has galloped forwards. I mean, if you take World War II, well, at the start of the war, there were still biplane fighters. 5 years later, there were jet fighters. You know, that whole generation that the likes of the Spitfire were the sort of, that was literally 5 years. It was a case of, this is state of the art for about the next 3 months, run of the mill for 6 months after that, and quaint after that. So you can have this period, you know, that technology moves on. And as a writer, I'm aware that, you know, I didn't make much reference to drones or any of that kind of stuff in my writing. And I think that sometimes, you know, you kind of pick the setting and the style you're going to work in, and you just try and make it internally work. Because to use somebody else's writing as an example, David Webber's Honorverse series, now he basically wanted to do Napoleonic naval combat in space, but he basically created ships where the propulsion system is such that you cannot shoot out or into the top of the ship. The only direction effectively ships can shoot out of is through their broadsides. You basically get, you know, ships giving it broadsides across light seconds of distance. But it works, you know, he makes it work internally consistently. One of the ones that I'd say doesn't work is some of the Star Wars prequels where you see soldiers walking across the battlefield in Napoleonic infantry style with weapons that appear to be akin to, you know, in terms of effectiveness, 20th century. So it's very much a case of, well, this is the equivalent of trying to march across a World War I battlefield in close formation. The French tried that in 1914. It hurt a lot. I think I've said enough. Over to
Yeah, like I mean, I think as writers, especially, it's on us to kind of try and envision what things could look like in the near future. A lot of my stuff would be very near future kind of too. I think one thing that kind of jumps out in my head is I don't know if anyone's seen it. It was an article either earlier in the year or maybe or late last year. It was like the French government have signed up French science fiction writers to help them explore what type of weaponry and technology their soldiers can use in the battlefield. And it was like, I think there was a demonstration where like there was one soldier on a hoverboard, but one that kind of like went up in the air. Now, obviously, like the kinks need to be worked out on how you can use that to deploy to a battlefield scenario. But I think the way we kind of move forward, like very similar to what Edmond said there, we constantly learn, and especially in times of kind of conflict, we will get a bit more experimental, and there is different ways of kind of looking at things. I think the Israeli army in particular, they explore a lot of kind of new types of technology, and some of it might be a little bit out there. But remember once seeing a gun that can kind of look around the corner. So we'd have very kind of straight barreled weapons, but they can kind of tilt it. So rather than kind of stick your head around or peek your head around or try and send 2 men to flank it, you can just tilt your barrel and you can see through the scope and you can take out an enemy without them ever kind of seeing you. So it's that type of thing. I think
I do remember reading somebody's comment that the problem with all of these gadgets and gizmos is you might end up with an infantryman that's like a plumber. He has to take a look at the problem and then run back to the van for the right tool.
Yeah, and that's true. And I think in Big Red, I kind of wanted it to be more section-based and platoon-based things, because my own personal ideas, or not ideas, but the way I kind of see things is similar to what you were saying, Kate, about they're trying to remove the boots from the ground concept. So it's all about aerial kind of power. And I don't really think that's working out too well. We're seeing kind of like what happened in Libya, and we're seeing the ability to do anything about Syria after 7 or 8 years of civil war. So I'm not too sure how that kind of works, but I kind of look at there's a fantastic book called We Were Soldiers, Once and Young, based on, well, not based on, but there was a film by Mel Gibson years later. But I think that is absolutely fascinating. It shows like the American Army had a cavalry division where they basically used soldiers and helicopters to drop them behind enemy lines and engage the enemy, and they utilized some of those tactics in Vietnam. But the way things are going now, with it being so pro kind of like air superiority, I can see that becoming much more kind of in use in future kind of theaters of conflict, where you send small groups of specialized special forces soldiers behind the lines to do the job that maybe 20 or 30 years ago would have taken a battalion or a regiment to kind of get done.
I have to say, in terms of science fiction technology, that I think is more of a when rather than if. Power armor, I think, would be the one that's really good, because at the moment, a World War I rifle will kill out to a comparable range to a modern assault rifle, Whereas if you have something where those old guns basically don't count anymore, where, you know, you drop your power armored soldier down and somebody sprays him with an AK-47 and his reaction is, my turn.
Is it raining?
That's going to be a point of radical change, you know. But that, as I say, I think is a win rather than the if.
Yeah, absolutely.
And these kind of thoughts are very much focused on the armament, the military tactics, the on the field, whether it's as a general making decisions or an admiral making decisions over the broader scale. But Kat, you've got the sort of background of growing up in the environment of it. Do you feel that there are particular areas of military sci-fi that are missing, that you just don't see enough of?
I think that sometimes we focus a lot on, in military sci-fi, we focus a lot on the soldiers and what's happening to them, which, don't get me wrong, great. Like, not saying let's get away from that. I know that for me, especially when my dad was deployed, it was it was just that constant fear, even if, like, not logically you know that he's probably safe, just because of, like, where things are located and that kind of thing, chances are safe. But there's still just that low level fear at the very least. And fear is stressful. So I think that maybe, like, sometimes if we could loop it back into what's going on at home, and that kind of thing, that it would give a humanizing aspect.
That's great point.
Because it's not just about people who are fighting. It's why are they fighting? What's the point? Why are they here instead of at home with their families? And maybe it's because they have to be. Maybe it's conscription and they didn't really have a choice. Or maybe it's because what they're fighting for is more important. And you need to know that balance.
That's a really great idea, Kat. I agree. I mean, if you ever have time, I'll write that book and I will read the living crap out of it. That's nail on the head with that point.
I might just make it my nano project.
Beta reader right here. Yeah, like I mean, for me, I kind of I think I want to see more Irish-centric stories. Now, I'm only saying that specifically because I'm Irish, but I mean, I'd like to explore themes that I can kind of relate to. And one of the things that kind of was, I don't want to say controversial, but one of the things that kind of got people talking a little bit or kind of asked me questions was in Big Red, you have Irish soldiers and British soldiers serving together to fight a common enemy. And that's not something I could ever fathom in my lifetime. I can't imagine any situation where Irish soldiers and British soldiers would be engaged in any type of, even a peacekeeping operation. They do train with each other. So Irish soldiers do go over to the UK and vice versa. Because Ireland is very active in the UN. We'd run a lot of courses over here and I had the pleasure of being at some of those courses. But I think I wanted to just strip away all the BS and just imagine a world where Irish and British soldiers got along with each other. There was no kind of like dragging up the history or kind of picking fights with each other over politics or religion. But as far as they were concerned, they were all together to do the right thing, even if they weren't in the end. But it's exploring the kind of themes like that. I think that's something I'd like to see a little bit more.
And what is bigger than their history?
Yeah.
Is what they're working on bigger than that?
Yeah. That's actually one in my new book. You know, its inciting element is an alien craft basically forced landing on the west coast of Ireland, and the Irish going, we suddenly have the most advanced piece of technology on the planet. Oh crap, everyone is going to use us as a battlefield to get it. And part of it is that sort of, oh, what can we do with what we have?
Yeah. That sounds brilliant.
which is one of the things is how much do you think, well, I'm not quite sure how to put it. The concept of military science fiction tends very heavily towards the US military, partly because of its history, partly because of where, you know, what made it popular and the Vietnam War coming out of it, and partly because we all have a big hang up about the Second World War and you know, the sort of societally we seem to always focus on that war, which had the huge American might come in and sort of blow through the cobwebs of where we were stuck and that kind of thing.
Well, I think the other thing about World War II is, without wanting to get too controversial, the Nazis were bad.
Yes, it was a very easy
Yeah.
war to
So
support one side versus the other. There was a bad guy and a good guy, and
yeah,
And World War I is a lot more complicated than that.
but yes,
So that's why it's so easy to focus on World War II, because it's pretty cut and dried, and you might have individuals inside a bad system that are good, but the sides themselves are pretty cut and dried.
Yeah.
that's very true. But you know, is there much in the way of non-American based, non military science fiction that doesn't look at the world? I mean, you've both written from sort of with Irish viewpoints in place. I suppose, Kat, it's an unfair question for you in some ways because you grew up in the American military side of things. But is there a non-majority viewpoint, a non-American part to the genre? How does that work? Damien, you got?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm trying not to jump in every time. But there is a market out there for it now. I'll put my hands up and say I'm not like fully versed on it. I can't kind of list off like 100 different books now, but I'll be very kind of active on Instagram more so than Facebook and Twitter. And there is like a lot of like I kind of like follow a few kind of authors based in South America who would write military science fiction, but they do it from their perspective and from their kind of cultural thing. So I mean, there is people out there doing it. There is a lot of indie kind of works out there from authors who aren't American or don't have the American kind of connection. And in particular, as I said with Big Red, I specifically wanted to write it from my cultural kind of point of view, as my own kind of take on what military science fiction should be. So I think like every other genre out there, there is kind of authors from their countries, from their outlooks, who are putting together some fantastic kind of pieces of work. And it's something I like as a trad author, I self-published first, and then I kind of went into traditional kind of publishing after I won a contract on Twitter, which is part of my talk later. So tune in for that. But yeah, I wanted to kind of do my own take and push my own kind of perspective on things. And I think as a trad author, I want to see more kind of indie authors out there tell the stories that they want to tell, to write from their points of view, to write about their experiences. And like you said, Kat, I absolutely love that kind of pitch for the book that you were chatting about earlier on, with the soldiers at home, or sorry, their families at home from their perspective. So I'd love to read that. Please write that book.
Yes, I have to write it.
Yeah, and go.
So Ed, your thoughts?
I think I lost the track of what the original question was.
We do that.
The non-majority, the non-big American viewpoint of military science fiction.
There are definitely a few. I'm trying to think, unfortunately, because I have a few on the Kindle. As I say, His Majesty's Starship was very much told from a non-American viewpoint. I think there was one. The first book of the series was Starship Ark Royal. I'm almost hard to define what is a non-American viewpoint. Is it, I mean, the Starship Ark Royal one, which I may just try and look up in a moment. I think maybe there's that element of, the British attitude. The British one was maybe this attitude of past glories. This thing is, I mean, that particular series was based around a ship that was case of, this was state of the art 50 years ago. And it's more the fact, it's based around the fact that this thing is, it's almost a little bit Battlestar Galactica. This thing is so horribly obsolete that when the big bads arrive and start ripping through all of the new stuff, it's a case of, we've just hit this thing with a plasma cannon. Right, I was designed to get hit a lot harder than that. My turn. Ping. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure I can add much more than babble for the next couple of minutes. So moving on.
Is most military sci-fi, I mean, we talked a little bit about this at the very, very beginning, but we talked about it being the military structure, or the Star Trek being potentially military. We did sort of briefly touch about the concept of stories with Firefly being military, because it used the war that has just happened has been such a big part of the story. But are there many military sci-fi stories that look at guerrillas or militias where the battle that's taking place is not organized? Does that count as military sci-fi? Is that a big part of the genre from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd certainly class that as part of the genre, because there's so many kind of countries out there that have been embroiled in wars that maybe didn't necessarily start themselves, or were kind of used by the two superpowers during the Cold War. So, I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I have read kind of a few books kind of like that, but I mean, it makes perfect sense for a country to kind of write about their own experiences, and then transfer to a science fiction setting. It's something that there's certain elements to it in Big Red. I can't really go too much into it without spoiling it, but there is an organized resistance to what's called the Mars Occupation Force, which is these Irish and British soldiers in a Nazi-founded colony, ironically enough. But they're taking on an enemy, and it's this enemy based them kind of loosely on the tactics used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, how they kind of like launch these very kind of hit and run guerrilla style attacks. They attack where you don't expect them to. They use tunnels to basically subvert the Mars Occupation Force's technology. They can hide underground to avoid the satellite detection, and they basically like will attack you from the rear and then disappear and melt away. So there would be elements to it, but yeah, I definitely classify that type of stuff as military sci-fi.
I think that there are more than one effective ways to fight, and the regimented military is one way that is very effective. Guerrilla warfare is another way that is also very effective, depending on what you're up against. Like, this is not going to be sci-fi, but I'm going to use this example anyway. The original Red Dawn, which I know more about than the
Wolverines rule.
Right, it's all guerrilla warfare, but it is definitely military.
Yeah, 100%.
It is very military tactics, even if it's not military ranks. It's so effective. I love it. I'm like, you can tell baby cat formative years watching this movie, drinking it all in. This is very effective psychological warfare.
Yeah.
And Ed, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely. I mean, the term that tends to get thrown around for that is asymmetric warfare, where you have one side that's designed for very much the conventional. We have tanks, we have artillery, we have infantry, and the other side say, well, we have 10 guys with AK-47s, and we will pop up. Where we will fight where we get brief local superiority, and then try and run away before the other side gets to. And I mean, Ireland has, the War of Independence was fought in that style. That element of the battle is nowhere, but it could be anywhere. Now I've had, my day job is the Department of Finance, and I'm actually in the archiving section. And one of the things we've come into contact with is files from the 20s related to, essentially compensation schemes that run after the War of Independence and the Civil War and the effects thereof. And it's been a very interesting picture in terms of, you can see obviously in Ireland there's the whole background, the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and the atrocities that were inflicted. But at the same time, these files, I've seen some of the reason why some of that happened. I mean, because there was unfortunately one file on a chap who lost a leg on Dublin Street because somebody basically threw a grenade at a passing army truck. Now, this guy was nothing to do with anything, but somebody threw a grenade and basically everyone on the street took their chances. And but I've got off topic.
Well, we're just about run out of time now, so I'm going to say thank you very much to everybody for your time this morning. I've enjoyed it greatly. I hope everyone else has too. There's a couple of questions that I'll drop into the Discord channel as well, so that maybe if anything didn't get properly answered, I tried to ask as many questions coming from the audience as possible, but they may not have all gotten answered. So I'll drop them into the Discord and we can follow up there and see how we're getting on. So thank you very much, everybody. I think that's it. Our producer can confirm for me when we're actually turned off, because I don't know how that works.
Oh, is she making the frantic cutting the throat noise symbol?
She is now.
Right.